I haven't done a fentanyl overdose, heroin, opioid type video in quite some time. And then I saw Professor Black Truth post this story on my timeline and say, you know what? Let me go ahead and talk about this. And it's crazy because I don't remember even mentioning or talking about this story ever on my channel. It's like this one must have slipped by me. But anyway, in this picture, you see a man by the name of William Hussel, or Hussel. His last name is spelled Hussel. So I'm not exactly sure how his last name is pronounced. It's either Hussel or Hussel. And he was a former doctor, and he was on trial because he was charged with 14 murder counts. And what were those murder counts? Because of the distribution of opioids that killed 14 people. Now, I have talked about opioids on my channel for a while. As a matter of fact, that's what really kicked off my original channel and how people managed to find me, because I was one of the few people that was pumping these kind of commentaries out there like that, because it was at that time in 2016 when they had announced that PC had became the face of opioids, and I just kind of took it and ran with it, and then it just kind of gained a life of its own. And even to this day in 2022, they still don't really talk about it like they should. And even when you had PC try to push for it to be a national emergency under the Trump administration, Trump really kind of turned a blind eye to it and just kind of left them to fend for themselves. But you have this doctor out of Franklin County, which is in Ohio, and we all know that Ohio is the hub for heroin. Like, they have the most overdoses out of any state in America. Like, their overdose rate is extremely high. That's why I call it the hub. But he was found not guilty. Now, they say, and y'all know who I'm talking about when I say they, say that people who distribute drugs or are drug dealers, or under the category of a drug dealer who distributes these narcotics to people and they die of an overdose, they should be charged with murder and most likely be found guilty of it. And we've heard stories where, you know, black people sometimes have been caught up in that, and they'll come up with these astronomically high numbers saying, oh, they sold enough fentanyl and heroin and opioids that could have took out a whole city. And we all know that they over exaggerated. But this guy was responsible for 14 deaths and was charged with 14 counts of murder and was found not guilty on all 14 counts. Amazing. And in Ohio, might I add. I wonder how they managed to come to that conclusion. But I'm speaking rhetorically. It was a rhetorical question, but I'm going to go ahead now and get into this article. Former Mount Carmel Health Systems Dr. William Hussel, or Hussel, walked out of the Franklin County Common Pleas Courthouse on Wednesday a free man. A jury found the former intensive care doctor not guilty on all 14 counts of murder in connection with the death of patients in his care after a 7-week trial and more than a week of deliberation. As Franklin County Common Pleas Court Judge Michael Holbrook read each verdict form, his wife Mariah Baird, seated in the gallery behind Hussel, watched and smiled. As the final form was read, she wrapped her arms around her sister and wept. She later hugged her husband. Hussel, standing next to one of his defense attorneys, Diane Minaj, wiped tears from his eyes after the verdicts were read. After deliberating since 10 a.m. April 12th, the 6 male and 6 female jurors initially could not all agree on whether Hussel, age 46, purposely killed 14 of his patients between 2015 and 2018. You couldn't determine that? This guy was the cause of 14 deaths. They made it seem like he was the only cause of one death. This is 14 people he was responsible for, that he gave these drugs to and let these people pretty much OD. As a doctor, that was very irresponsible of him to do. As a doctor. Someone who has access to these drugs and was just giving them out like it was candy during Halloween and the kids were trick-or-treating. And they couldn't determine if he was guilty or not. That, to me, was an open and shut case. Guilty on all counts. With even one guilty verdict for murder, Hussel would have served life in prison with eligibility for parole in 15 years. This was the only verdict that justice could have given, said Hussel's other defense attorney, Jose Baez. This verdict speaks to not only William, but all those doctors and nurses out there who are attempting their best to give comfort care in a very difficult situation. Before I even go and read any further, this is why I hate reading these attorneys' statements when it comes to this, because it makes them appear to be some of the biggest douchebags on the planet. Like, are y'all hearing this? They're basically excusing his behavior and trying to make it seem like he was under so much stress. He gave these individuals some heavy narcotics where all 14 people died over the span of 3 years, from 2015 to 2018. Imagine had they not caught him, how many more bodies would have been under his belt. As far as I'm concerned, this guy is a murderer. Just not in the court of law, he isn't. But in the court of public opinion, he is. And he's lucky that the court of public opinion doesn't decide his fate. Because being behind bars for the rest of his life probably will be the least of his worries. And I hope they don't allow him to go into being a doctor again. He doesn't need to be. They don't need to be looking over their shoulder wondering if they're ever going to get charged with a crime. So basically what you're also saying is that if this happens to more doctors, then they'll be found not guilty as well, right? Or all the charges will be dropped against them, right? That's what they're saying. So y'all need to keep this in mind. The next time a doctor, let's say preferably a black doctor, gets hemmed up with something like this, keep this story in mind and keep what this attorney said in mind as well. Hussel still faces more than 10 active civil lawsuits from the families of patients who died while under his care. And now the thing is, because they found him not guilty on these, it's probably going to be hard for those families. It would be easy for them if he was found guilty. But then again, who knows? Several families have already settled civil lawsuits worth millions of dollars, most likely paid by the taxpayers. After the jury had left the courtroom to meet with Holbrook, Hussel was asked whether he was relieved. Yeah, he replied. Friends of his family said that he has been going to church daily. Asked about this, Hussel said, my lawyer doesn't want me making any comments. Bay said Hussel hopes to one day practice medicine again in the future, hopefully not in the near future or at any future, period. Hussel's license was suspended by the Ohio Medical Board and he allowed its renewal to lapse. I think this prosecution harmed more lives than it could have ever helped, Bay said. People are just trying to ease suffering, but doctors who have no motive or no reason to want to harm someone shouldn't be looked at in a negative light. But that's the thing. He was responsible for the deaths of 14 people for drug overdoses. I don't care how they spin it. The guy is a murderer. I said it. Like I said, he just isn't seen as one in the court of law, but in the court of public opinion, he is. The Franklin County's prosecutor office released a short statement following the verdict, commending the work done by both sides. The jury, after review of all the evidence, was not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that William Hussel was guilty of any charges submitted to them. We accept the jury verdict. Franklin County Prosecutor Gary Tyack was not made available to answer other questions about the case, including whether any nurses or pharmacists might face charges. The members of the jury did not wish to speak to the media on Wednesday and were transported out of the courthouse in vehicles. The trial, which may have been the longest in Franklin County history and is one of the longest in Ohio history, was steeped in medical jargon and ethical questions. A core issue was how much is too much when a doctor prescribes fentanyl and other painkillers for critically ill patients when removing breathing tubes. Another was whether a doctor can end the life of a patient who is about to die, even for compassionate reasons. Hussel's defense argued that his dosing practices were for comfort care only and that death for his critically ill patients was imminent. So because they knew they was going to die, they said, you know what, let me just go give you these extra bit of dosages and we'll just take you out faster. That's what is screaming to me. It's almost like this guy was playing God. Prosecutors equated Hussel or Hussel. Listen. If I'm pronouncing his name correctly, forgive me. High dosing to what veterinarians might use to humanly put down animals, but unacceptable for humans. One expert witness said doses of up to 2,000 micrograms of fentanyl ordered by Hussel for some patients were enough to kill an elephant. That sounds like that that tranquilizer. I forgot which brand of opioid that is, the one that's like an elephant tranquilizer. So this guy was giving dosages to human beings that was enough to take down an elephant. Do you know how many tons an elephant weighs? And he was giving this to people who probably weigh maybe hundreds, in the pounds of hundreds. I don't know what his heaviest patient was, but let's just say they weigh in the upper high hundreds and lower to mid 200s versus an elephant that weighs tons and can crush you just by stepping on you. Hussel prescribed the opioid sedatives and paralysis-inducing drugs to patients during the night shift in the former Mount Carmel West Hospital in Franklinton. Some of these patients were comatose, others had multiple organ failures, but it was the large doses of fentanyl that Hussel prescribed that became a prosecution focus. The state's experts testified that Hussel's dosing was 10 to 20 times higher than was necessary to control pain during removal of breathing tubes during palliative extubations. 10 to 20 times higher. This guy was overprescribing these meds, well, these drugs. He was overprescribing 10 to 20 times higher. I wonder what the actual recommended doses is. We now know it's less than 10, but this guy was giving 10 to 20 times higher than the recommended dosage amount. Just like when you get drugs on labels, it always tells you the recommended amount that you have to take and how many for every hour, or how many hours you have to take it in between. Like, take this every 4 hours or once a day. Don't exceed this amount, or don't go, taking these every hour on the hour, because you will overdose. And then they weigh in your age, your gender as well, and your condition. This guy just decided, I'm going to throw all of that out the window and do whatever the hell I want to do. And that's how he has 14 people on his watch dead from the span of 2015 to 2018. But in their eyes, he's not guilty. It's like they had all this evidence right there in front of them, and they just chose to turn a blind eye. Hussel didn't testify, but his defense attorneys maintained he was providing pain and anxiety relief at the behest of relatives. Several relatives testified that they were never told what specific drugs and dosages were being administered, and that Hussel led them to believe that death would be natural after their removal from life support. So this guy was sitting up here just lying to the family members. And I kind of figured that that's what they were going to say after reading that previous statement, saying that the family told him this and that, but the family was like, no, he didn't say that, and he didn't give us the whole story. We didn't even know I wouldn't even be surprised if some of them didn't even know what they were taking, because usually the doctors have to have an open communication with the family members, like, what are they about to give them? What is it for? How much are they going to have to take? It sounds to me like there was a disconnect in communication, or he just was not communicating with them at all. Like, this guy has so many red flags planted around him and swirling and hovering above him, and they still found him not guilty on every count. And someone has said in Professor Black Truth's comment section that they said they believe that this is a possibility that most of the patients, if not all of them, were PC. And I can believe that too, because let's be real here. While there are other groups of people who suffer from fentanyl and opioid overdoses, who's the majority that does suffer them? And this is Ohio we're talking about here. And remember what I was telling you about how PC will get on code against each other to save mainly a male PC's ass? If what I'm thinking is true, it happened here again. This will be the third time that I have pointed that out. Because remember, the first one was that story that happened in the upper Northeast, where you had that boy or that 19-year-old, how old he was, that was having a revolving door of young girls, minor girls, teenagers at the time, coming in to be violated by him. He got put on trial, and he got found not guilty on all charges, or all the charges were dropped, or whatever the case may be, because of the family he came from. And then on top of that, his mother and family members was helping him do it. Nothing happened with them because of the money that they had, that old money. Money talks, BS walks. Then you have the one, that Bowen Turner down in South Carolina, who had been found not guilty, or the charges were dropped, or whatever the case may be, on what he did. Again, PC versus PC. Now you have this story. Like I said, we don't know what the ethnicity is of the people of his victims, but if we're to assume that they looked like and identified as he did, that is yet again as PC getting on code and flexing its code against itself to save and protect more so the male portion of their community. Now, y'all tell me if that code isn't wicked or not. Among the more than 50 witnesses for the prosecution were nurses, pharmacists, and relatives or guardians of the 14 deceased patients. Many of those witnesses were defense witnesses. Bays said about 90% of the witnesses for the prosecution were all incredibly favorable to the defense, and we would have considered calling them in our case in chief. He said the nurses should have been mad at Hussel for losing their jobs, and in some cases careers, over the investigation into Hussel's dosing habits. So look at that. He caused the loss of employment for his nurses for what he did. And hypothetically speaking, they may not have been involved. They may not have even known what this guy was doing. Who knows what he was telling them? But because of guilt by association, they had to go too, because it would have been too much of a risk to keep them around knowing that they were working close with him. He would have gotten sued just off of that alone. If I was working with him and didn't know what he was doing and I get fired because of his wrongdoings, and then he gets to walk, that makes it even worse, because now I'm still out of a job. And if I wanted to go work at another hospital and they pulled up anything, or they asked me, was there a reason why I was fired from a previous place? This is going to come up. Guilt by association. And I was not even associated with this person. I'm speaking, in hypotheticals, if I'm using myself as an example. They most likely weren't involved. I wouldn't be surprised if at least one was, but I'm going to, leap out here and say that all of them weren't, or most of them weren't. And he cost them their livelihood, as far as we know, because of his actions. And he gets to walk. There will be a meeting outside the courtroom, and we'll be right back in there for assault charges. They stood up for what was right, Bays said. They stood up against the drumbeat for a conviction in this case, but for their bravery, we would not be here with a not guilty verdict. Bays said he believed the turning point in the case was the first day of trial, when the attorneys made their opening statements to the jury. There were facts that on the surface might look bad, but we knew there were other factors that could explain that. Bays said the defense rested after calling only one witness because they felt they didn't need to do any more to prove their case. They could have called 100 witnesses, he said. They weren't going to change the facts, and they weren't going to change the evidence. Judge Holbrook said jurors told him that procedures for properly dispensing of fentanyl and other drugs weren't properly explained, and that too many witnesses were used, complicating their presentation. He also said that there could have been a better reason for fentanyl having no maximum dosage for use in end-of-life care. If it were me trying the case, I would have called in 5 experts, rested, and let them move on. He called the stress factor in this case extremely high. When the jury deadlocked on Monday, the judge said it apparently was caused by one juror. Holbrook said he didn't know or even ask what the juror was at that point. Holbrook said the collective jury decision was the right one based on their attention to detail, copious note-taking, and ability to get along. Asked if the jury made the right decision, Holbrook said he agrees with whatever a jury decides in any case, so long as they consider all the evidence carefully. That just seems like such a weak response. Like it sounds like a very mid response. Like, I'll accept whatever it is as long as everything was examined carefully. See, and that's the thing. These judges, they got to examine these and investigate a lot of these judges. I always ask them that afterward, and then he tells them, if you are convinced, I'll agree with you. Family members of the 14 patients did not comment on Wednesday on the verdict. The 14 patients, in order of the verdict forms and their date of death, are Joanne Belisari, age 69, died May 10, 2015, 17 minutes after 1,000 microgram fentanyl dosage. Ryan Hayes, age 39, April 3rd, 2017, 14 minutes after 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl. Now look at how fast these people are dying. 14 minutes after they got administered. Beverly Schertzinger, sorry about that, 63, October 10, 2017, within 10 minutes of 500 micrograms of fentanyl. And look at the ages. The ages also determine it as well, as far as the timing goes. And probably if anyone had maybe any other like underlying issues as well. Danny Millette, age 74, December 17th, 18 minutes after 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl. Brandy McDonald, 37, January 14, 2018, 5 minutes after 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl. Francis Burke, age 73, January 14, 2018, 16 minutes after 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl. Jeremiah Hodge, April 1st, 2018, 5 minutes after 800 micrograms of fentanyl. James Allen, age 80, May 28, 2018, 20 minutes after 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl. Troy Allison, age 44, July 15, 2018, 3 minutes after 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl. Bonnie Austin, age 64, September 30, 2018, 30 minutes after 600 micrograms of fentanyl. James Timmons, age 39, October 24th, 2018, 10 minutes after 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl. Sandra Castle, age 80, November 13, 2018, 23 minutes after 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl. Rebecca Walls, age 75, November 16, 2018, 5 minutes after 1,000 micrograms of fentanyl. And Melissa Penix, age 82, November 20th, 2018, 4 minutes after 2,000 micrograms of fentanyl. It sounds to me like she got the major amount, and she appeared to be the oldest person in the group. One relative, Jim Allen, testified he wanted his father, James Allen, to live into his 81st birthday, but he died 20 minutes after a nurse injected the fentanyl ordered by Hussel. The trial was marked by lots of in-court arguing, numerous delays, and unsuccessful motion to disqualify 2 defense witnesses, and Holbrook consumed more than a week of the 7-week trial. Bays' motion to disqualify Holbrook, which was unsealed Wednesday by the Ohio Supreme Court after the verdict, involved a comment Holbrook made during the process of forming the jury instructions. Holbrook quipped that the term killer doctor should be used in the instructions instead of defendant during what the judge said was a moment of frustration, which led Bays to file the motion. This was not something we could stand by, Bays said. If anyone knows me or the way we try cases, we fight hard for our clients. All we ask for is a fair shake in trial. A lot of what was not seen in the background were the struggles that we had putting forward our case, Bays added. The state was not having it. They had no interest in the jury knowing the complete story. They were selective as to what they wanted the jury to hear. Bays said this is the first case he has seen where the jury never heard what the defendant told detectives when he was interviewed. Hussel began working for the Mount Carmel in 2013, serving as an intensive care doctor, primarily at Mount Carmel West. He was removed from treating patients on November 21st, 2018, and fired on December 5th, 2018, after a hospital employee expressed concerns about Hussel in October 2018 and then again in November 2018. Hussel's dosing practices alarmed hospital administrators enough to contact the patients' families in early 2019 and eventually the Columbus police. Those admissions, along with the suspensions and eventual firing of Hussel and up to 20 nurses and 6 pharmacists, sent a strong signal that Mount Carmel and its Michigan-based Catholic health system parent Trinity Health did not have adequate safeguards in place at the time to prevent lethal overdoses. The criminal case was initially led by former longtime Franklin County prosecutor Ron O'Brien, a Republican who lost his seat to Tyack, a Democrat, in November 2020. Several of O'Brien's lead prosecutors in the case also lost their jobs or quit the transition. O'Brien did not comment on the verdict. On Wednesday, Mount Carmel issued a statement saying their role was never assigned criminal to guilt Hussel. Our role has always been to live up to our core beliefs and mission as a healthcare provider. That's why we took action regarding our concerns with the doses in these cases and shared the information we had with local authorities and impacted families, the hospital system said. We had extensive measures in place designed to prevent anything like this from ever happening again in our health system. We are fully committed to patient safety and will take action whenever patient safety is an issue. What began 4 years ago as a homicide investigation involved Hussel and 25 victims eventually was pared down in late January to what Tyack's office believed were 14 of the strongest cases. So check that out. It was more than 14, but they only went with the 14 strongest of the 25. Man, y'all can't tell me that PC privilege isn't real with this one. It's like every time I come with a story involving PC privilege, they just get worse and worse and worse. Tayak had told the dispatch after his election that he was considering reducing the number of charges in the Hussel case, saying that it was a waste of time and resources to incarcerate a man for more lifetimes than he has. So even then, they still gave him a bunch of protection. And that's the whole entire article right there. My God, that's crazy. That is some wild stuff right there. Whew. That was a lot to digest. That was a lot to take in, what I just read. But, like I said, and I'll probably put it on this thumbnail, he is guilty in the court of public opinion. While he got off scot-free in the court of law, he is guilty in the eyes of the public. He is guilty in the eyes of the relatives of those families who lost their, let me rephrase that. He is guilty in the eyes of the relatives who lost loved ones due to his wrongdoings. And if the people who worked for him did not have any involvement with what he did, he is guilty for the loss of employment and steady income. Like, this guy is guilty on more than just the lives that he contributed to taking away. He is guilty just all the way around, just of who he is, period. And everything in between. This is not a good person right here. And I hope that this story goes far and wide to especially a lot of people in the medical field to keep an eye on this guy and to not hire him. He does not need to be practicing medicine anywhere else anymore. I don't care if it's at the smallest local hospital where you can go to a rural town and you only got that one hospital, to going to a big city and working at a hospital like, say, Johns Hopkins. He does not need to be there. Point blank, period.